Welcome, everybody, to the Troubadour podcast and a new series I'm doing called Troubadour Talks. And we're going to be talking today about a great work of literature, We the Living by Ayn Rand. And I have a guest to talk with me about this. His name is Jon Hersey. He's from the objectivestandard.org or the Objective Standard Institute. And we're going to talk about the plot, the characters, the story to the best of our abilities. We really want to get into the personal of why this is great art to us, what we like about it, what its relevance, what we think its relevance is to today. And really the purpose of the show of Troubadour Talks is to have a robust discussion, not necessarily a full analysis of every aspect of the book, but just a discussion about the work, what it means to us and we think it means to the world and why people should read this book in particular. So before we get into the plot summary and what's going on with We the Living, I wanted to talk a little bit about two projects that we are working on separately. I'm working on something and Jon is working on. Let's start with Jon real quick. So Jon, you are working on the Objective Standard Institute. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, definitely. But first, thanks so much for having me on the show, Kirk. I love this book, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to come on and talk about it. So I'm a fellow and an instructor at Objective Standard Institute. Objective Standard Institute promotes the ideas of Ayn Rand, along with ideas of rational philosophy and practices for good living more generally. We offer courses. I teach a course titled How to Write Powerfully in Defense of Liberty. And I also teach a follow-up course to that, which is an advanced writing workshop. We've also got courses on history, the history of liberty, economics. We've got an upcoming course. If you're interested in Ayn Rand, we've got an upcoming course that will be taught by my boss, one of the founders of Objective Standard Institute, Craig Biddle, going to be doing an introduction to Ayn Rand's philosophy. So if you're interested in this conversation, you might find that course really interesting. We also put on conferences. We have the TOSCon yearly conference, and that's coming up in July in Boston. So if you're interested in some of these topics, you can find a lot more about them by checking out our website, objectivestandard.org, and coming to our conference. But I am intrigued with this new project that you've got going, Kirk. And, we were talking a little bit before we came on the show here about what you're doing. And you mentioned a magazine and some other things. So I'd love to hear more about what you've got going on.
Yeah, so thank you. And the Troubadour Mag is a website that I started 2 years ago dedicated to, I originally dedicated to romantic literature, but it's kind of expanded from there where I'm talking about just great works of art and what is a great work of art. And in that search, I've learned a lot about this thing called the literary canon, the Western literary canon. And there's a lot of debate about it. And I was inspired that there was this movement, Disrupt Texts, that happened recently where it's a bunch of teachers. This is by teachers, for teachers, this movement. It was mostly on Twitter, but went pretty viral, where they are a concerted effort to get rid of any of these canonical works in teaching them. And now this is not a new effort. This is the culmination of decades of work of intellectuals attacking the literary canon. And by this, just, I'll say the canon is essentially the major Western works from the Iliad to, you could say Gatsby and Rand. It's the most influential works of all Western literature. It's the Dante, the Miltons, the Aeneid by, Virgil. It's Ovid. It's a lot, these great works, Shakespeare, of course. And they're trying to cut these out. And so I wanted to start a club where people who are dedicated to reading this. And that's what the Literary Canon Club is. You can actually reserve a spot. So we only accept people in batches of 6 to 8. But you can reserve a spot if you go to troubadourmag.com and you'll see Literary Canon Club, or you could type in troubadourmag.com/literary-canon-club. But if you Google it, it'll just pop up. So that's what I'm working on. And I think it's going to be, it's an interesting, we both have magazines that we work for or work on. Like you work Objective Standard Institute is a separate institute from the Objective Standard, correct?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
so it's separate, but the Objective Standard, which I have a couple of articles from back in the day in there, very rigorous. So you're teaching writing, which is amazing because you have very rigorous standards. So anybody who's interested in writing nonfiction, I think, should definitely look into taking one of these classes. I can say just with working with the editors over there, it is a very enlightening experience and very helpful as a thinker and as a writer.
Thank you. Yeah, I know we want to get to We the Living, but I just wanted to say that I think what you're doing with the canon is incredibly important. And you're right, it's a decided effort that's been going on for decades, but actually more than decades, centuries, I would say, back to the Counter-Enlightenment. And that's something that we might talk more about as we discuss We the Living, because there's a commonality there as well. But there are some great books programs left in the country. There's the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism has the Lyceum program for undergrads who want to study the great books of the Western canon. But they're few and far between. And outside of higher level academia, outside of colleges, I really don't think that other than a handful of private schools that are interested in teaching these works, that there are too many that are. And, largely because of the ideas that I think We the Living spotlights, some of the really terrible ideas that are still at work in our culture today.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the motivations we can go into talking about We the Living now is, for me, I've always tried to understand how to classify Ayn Rand as a literary writer. So there's a lot of intellectuals who focus on her ideas, which is very important, and her philosophy of objectivism. There are a few very good ones, don't get me wrong. Some that I've learned from. I don't want to attack people who are doing this, but there is much less when it comes to Ayn Rand, the novelist, and Ayn Rand born, and you might have to help me with some of this stuff, born 1905 to 1982, right? Those are her dates. And she, so she was a Russian born, then immigrated to America. And, she was a literary writer and she saw herself as a literary writer. But I think her legacy has been so focused on her ideas, we often don't think about her novels as literary novels. And in fact, they're heavily attacked by that. And so that's one of the things I'm glad to have you here to talk about We the Living, because I think it'll be a good conversation. I mean, we could talk about the ideas. I don't want to shut those off. That's a big part of her motivation. But I think there's also a literary response that, fitting it into the canon in a sense will be relevant to it.
In terms of classifying Rand, she considered herself to be a romantic realist. She said that unlike a naturalist whose goal is to portray what life really is, her goal was to portray what life could and should be. And in order to do that, she had to come up with her own philosophy. She had to come up with what we call objectivism. Her philosophy of objectivism is what enabled her to create the kinds of heroes that she wanted to see in fiction. And so these two things, novelist, philosopher, you often see her name given hyphenated, Ayn Rand, novelist, philosopher. I think she primarily considered herself a novelist, and that she had to create an entire philosophy just to achieve the literary goals that she had, which is absolutely mind-boggling and incredible. Yeah, but you're right. Her philosophy of objectivism it's through and through her novels, most obviously through Atlas Shrugged, and that's a novel with long philosophic speeches that sometimes people skip or attack, and I think wrongly so. I think that there are necessary plot pieces, but there is this thing that definitely makes her different than a lot of novelists, and that probably is what you're talking about. It makes her a little bit more difficult to classify, because there are I don't think any other novelists in history who have created a philosophy just so that they could achieve their literary goals. But I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know of any. there are probably some who think that they did that or something like that, but that actually accomplished in, creating a whole, all 5 branches of philosophy, that she had clear ideas and she wrote out, and published eventually her thoughts on, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics. Like she had unique ideas at all of those. And like you're saying, I did a lot of the publishing after she wrote her major novels. But they're in her major novels, and I think she's kind of working through them sometimes in these novels. And speaking of that, why don't we do something that I like to do with the Literary Canon Club, which is, to the best of our ability, and we can work together on this. I might need your help. I don't think I haven't read We the Living in 8 years, but I read it several times in my 20s, and I'm rereading it now. And I'm hooked on it now. All of a sudden, I just started reading it like a week or so ago. And before we start talking about it more, because I have a lot to say about it, I know you do, I want to see if we can just give a quick overview of what's going on. And I'll just start real quick and, pass on to you. And like I said, fill in whatever you want, interrupt, let me know. But essentially what I recall is it starts with this young lady, 18 years old, Kira. And by the way, I might mispronounce some of these Russian names. Argonov. And she is moving back with her family to Petrograd. This is after the Russian Revolution that ended in like 1922. So I think it's around 22 when she gets there. And so that's a major backdrop. And I think it does sometimes help to have a little bit of knowledge about the Russian Revolution, which we could talk about later. And essentially the story is her trying to, live her life to become an engineer. She meets a young man named Leo, who she pretty much instantly falls in love with. And she also meets another man at the technical institute that she enrolls in to become an engineer, named Andrei Taganov. I always put an R there for some reason. Andrei Taganov. And he is from he's basically a GPU member. He's a communist party member, and he's a revolutionary hero.
Yeah. Right? He's part of the GPU, which was the Soviet secret police. And Kira is this very willful, independent daughter of a bourgeois family that fled to the Crimea, hoping that the communists would not be successful, hoping that the white army that they opposed would prevail. And after 5 years away, they left their home and all their possessions, and they fled to the Crimea, and they come back, and here they are. The book, I want to say the movie because it's just so epic. It begins with her and her family, Kira and her family, returning to Petrograd, and like you said, trying to live in conditions that are unlivable. And you see this throughout the book, these just horrific conditions caused by the various regulations and the basically the state interference with life. So she meets Andrei Taganov, she meets Leo Kovalensky, and they fall in love. Leo is the son of a famous counter-revolutionary admiral, Admiral Kovalensky. He hasn't participated in any battles himself. He is not. At one point he says that he was interested in having the Tsar overthrown, but then he went to a communist meeting. You see him go to a communist meeting, and hearing the talk of sacrifice for the brotherhood of mankind totally turned him off. And he said, whistled "Long live the Tsar" as he's leaving. But
that's Leo.
Leo, yes.
Yeah.
Leo Kovalensky. This is who Kira falls in love with. Yeah. And they attempt to flee the country because they see it as a death trap. They understand what's happening around them, that the Soviet state is impinging upon all parts of life, and they're just unable to have the lives that they want. They attempt to flee, and they're caught. Luckily, Leo is spared. The captain is that
Timoshenko?
Soviet captain. Yes,
Timoshenko, right? Yeah. Because was he like he knew Leo's father and had respect for him as a man, even though he's a communist. Timoshenko, is that correct? Am I?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Timoshenko was he
So
was
that
in.
saves both of them.
Mhm.
Kira and Leo, they would normally probably be shot if it
Yeah,
wasn't for the will of this Timoshenko character. But of course they have to return to Petrograd, and I think they get an apartment together at that point, and they start to live together, Kira and
yeah,
Leo.
yeah. To the great despair of Kira's parents, who
Hmm.
are traditional Christians and think that a man and a woman should not live together unless they're married. They do. They move in together. Kira is she doesn't have a religious bone in her body. What she wants of life is to live her life to the fullest, and so they move in together. She meets Andrei Taganov at the Institute, and they, this is one of the things that we should discuss here is
Yeah.
they become fast friends, or not fast friends because at first they're definitely uh, they have some antipathy toward each other, but
Yeah.
they develop this strange relationship where they are both very respectful of one another and both have they're able to speak to each other about their very differing views on life and politics.
Yeah. So they become friendly, and it is an interesting friendship because he is a crusader for the cause of the Communist Party. He's a true believer. Not just, he's trying to rise up in the ranks, but he's someone who really, he comes from poverty. This is Andrei Taganov, comes from poverty, and he thinks of the Red Party and fighting for that Red Party against the Tsar as that this is a way to get people like me who are in poverty, but they're pushed down by this czarist regime, that this new party will rise up people like that this is the way for the proletariats. In his mind, I think the proletariats are noble-minded men like him that are just happen to be born at the bottom, right? And quote unquote the bottom. And so that's kind of his view. And so he's a crusader. Kira's a different kind of crusader, which we can maybe hold on to what kind of crusader she is, because she's not a crusader for a political idea. And I think this is really hard for people, especially today in America, to grasp that someone could be a crusader for something that's not political or that's not religious. In the, like for Christianity, it's for something very unique to, I think, Ayn Rand and her view of things. So they become friends. And then I think the way the plot basically plays out, because that's the major conflict we just already established, is you have Leo, and I guess you have to mention, or we should mention, that Andrei hates Leo. Leo's the antithesis of everything that Andrei hates in the world, and Andrei is the antithesis of everything Leo hates. And so it's basically a love triangle in a sense, because Andrei loves Kira, Kira loves Leo, but Kira also likes and respects Andrei. But then there's this conflict because the two of them, really despise and probably kill each other and tear each other to pieces type hatred. And but it becomes, as the plot goes on, that Leo gets tuberculosis, or he becomes infected, or it's, I don't know, I don't remember the term. He doesn't quite get a full blown case, but it can blossom into a full blown case of TB, of tuberculosis, which was very deadly at this time. And he needs to be sent south to the Crimea. The only way he could do that is through Andrei. Of course, he can't ask, and he will never ask, but Kira secretly starts an affair with him, Andrei, in order to save her lover, Leo. And so that's a big part of the conflict, and it plays out. And we could talk about the ending. I just want to say there are spoilers in this, in our discussion. There probably will be. But I'll let you know when the big spoilers come, and we could try to save that for the end if we do want to talk about. And we can leave like the major spoiler at the very end for people to read. I figure I want to maybe spoil everything, but hopefully people who are getting into this discussion with us have read We the Living. Otherwise, you may want to go read it a little bit at some point soon and then come back to our discussion.
Yeah, I think we've done a good job outlining it. And so, that's the situation, so to speak. And if you find that intriguing, I think you'll really find the book intriguing. I agree.
Yeah.
I don't think we should go into too many spoilers here. I want to amplify just one thing that you just said, which was that Andrei and Leo are, bitter enemies and rivals over Kira. I know we mentioned this, that Andrei represents the party, and Leo represents his father was a counter-revolutionary. He represents the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class, upper class, who had respect for property rights, who respected the great works of art, respected the individual's ability to do what he wants with his life to an extent. Obviously, Tsarists thought that, there's a long and interesting history with Russian politics, but there was actually quite liberal views among many of the higher ranking Russian officials. And then those were repeatedly quashed in various events in Russian history. But these are respectable people that respect the individual and respect the basic rights that people have. And
within a certain context, like not in an American, just to be clear, not in an American sense of individual rights and property, I don't think, right?
I think that Kira definitely does.
Well, no, I mean, I'm sorry. I mean the Tsarists.
The Tsarists, no.
Yeah. So like, I think it's helpful when reading this book because it's written in 1934, published in 36, but it's written about the 20s. Ayn Rand was a student in Petrograd, right? She was a student in Petrograd in 1922 to 24, I think, or 21 to 24. And I think she fled to America after she did get a degree at Petrograd in history. So she's very familiar with this world, with what happened after the revolution and during the revolution. But I just think it's important historically to remember that the Tsarists, while they maybe had some inclinations, prior to the revolution for a little bit more individual rights and property rights, it's not established in the same way that it is in America. It's not part of their culture. It was kind of just like they're giving it to them. And I think Rand makes this point in the novel when it's when she's talking about, I think, Andrei's exploits in the war. And she talks about the red versus the white. And the problem that the whites had is that they didn't really stand for anything. Like they stood for the Tsars and the old ways, but there were legitimate problems with the old ways. It wasn't the greatest society it could have been. And I do think like when reading this book, it really helps to keep in mind, it's not like we're talking about, America, 19th century America versus the Communist Party. It's, Tsarist Russia and its problems versus the modern state. Now within Kira, she represents American sensibilities. We could talk about that. But I think the backdrop, the context of the world that Kira has entered is this world that's battling between those two forces.
Yeah, this is one of the really interesting things, and one of the great things I think about the novel is if it were a mere piece of propaganda, you would have one side very clearly and thoroughly and consistently always be represented as the better, even if it weren't, even if it were supposed to reflect historical fact. Rand does a really good job of making even some of the definite villains of this book honorable to a certain degree, and she gives you enough of their character to really empathize to some extent, even with the people who, in the end, are the most evil. Mm-hmm. And so this is one of the things that I think she really does well, and one of the things that she takes from Victor Hugo. Hugo always made his characters, whether he agreed with their views or not, he did a really good job of making both his villains and his heroes understandable to people, to making their conflicts understandable, and making them relatable people, so that it wasn't just cardboard cutouts of this idea versus that idea, and it's very clear that he's just writing in order to promote an idea.
Yeah, we'll have to. Well, maybe we can talk about this real quick. It's a little off topic, but it's because it's funny that you say that, in the sense that the common criticism against Rand as a literary writer is that her characters are cardboard cutouts. And that is like the most common criticism I read. Now, I agree with you that they're absolutely not cardboard cutouts. But even if you just like Google and go to just normal everyday reviewers, just people who, do YouTube reviews, that's one I've seen like 3 times in a row. That's one thing that they'll say, or that people will say that about it. Or I think even Jordan Peterson has said something along those lines, the intellectual Jordan Peterson. And it's a very interesting, there's a book that I recently read by Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind. I don't know if you've read that book. But he's a popular, literary critic. And he said, he calls Rand's work hardly literature is the word he uses. So he says hardly literature. And it's now, I don't want to turn the whole discussion into that about her criticisms or people who criticize her, but it's interesting about the cardboard cutout and about these characters and are they cardboard cutouts or are they in-depth characters? And you said they are not cardboard cutouts. I agree with you, but it's interesting to think about why people might have that thought and why it's, I think, so prevalent. And I'll just say real quick, my first impression of it's something I'm trying to understand. Like I'm trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. I think a lot of it is that they hear their professor say that, and so they say it. They just kind of mouth their words that someone else they read, or they read it online from some Slate article or something. Ayn Rand has cardboard cutouts, and so they say, "Yeah, okay, Ayn Rand has cardboard." Because if you read these things, they never give examples. Like they never, ever give. It's like you have 2,500 words or pages of fiction in her 4 or 5 or 3,000 pages of, like, you could get an example to tell us what you're talking about, and they never do. But I think what they're getting, or what the reason that impression even exists at all, is that the main characters, primarily the protagonists, so not the other characters, but as much, I think, but the main characters in particular do so solemnly, sacredly know what they want out of life. They know it, like they can articulate it. They know it in their bones, what they want out of life, which gives them an approach to life which is very alien to almost all of us. And to some degree, it's not 100% realistic, because even the Thomas Edisons don't 100% have that. But this is, an aspect of Ayn Rand's, in terms of even a Thomas Edison who really knows what he wants, he's gung-ho, he's very strict and severe, which is, how Ayn Rand describes her characters often. And you're fired. If you mess up, you're fired. And you do this, it's 10,000, ligaments or whatever it's called. Not ligaments. You know what I'm talking about. The filaments. Thank you for the light bulb. And so there is a severity of that type of person who does something like that. But it comes from knowing what they want. But even Thomas Edison probably had some, conflicts that, about what he really wanted out of life. And I think that's what they're getting at. But with Rand characters, this is literature. And you said this earlier about what literature and art is about showing for Rand. It's showing about what life could be or ought to be. And although a lot of these other characters, like Andrei, is conflicted, that he has a deep conflict. And so to call him a cardboard cutout is ridiculous. Kira she has certain conflicts, but she knows what she wants. And so it gives her a straight, like a knife through the world, a plot experience, I guess, or action, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, with all of this stuff, the thing to do for listeners here is to go read the book for yourself and decide for yourself. But I would say when you do, pay special attention to Andrei. If Rand wanted to, she could have made him a very unsympathetic character, very cardboard-like cutout. He could have just sat around and spouted party lines, and instead of being a really honorable guy that Kira develops some feelings for, he could have just been somebody who was willing to take on a prostitute. She didn't make him that way. She made him, like you said, a very conflicted character. One who we really, there are certain parts of the book that just show that he is to some extent within his sphere, he is somewhat honorable. The scene that comes to mind that readers should look out for is the one involving Captain Karsavin or Karsavin. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. But this is just an incredible scene, and it makes you feel something for someone that when you step back, you really realize, like, on the whole, this is not a good person. But this is just one example of many.
What does he do in that scene? So I'm actually not recalling that 100% because I haven't gotten back to that. So what does he do in that scene?
So Andrei is fighting in a battle. He's fighting against the White Army, and there's one last really formidable enemy, one last captain that they know if he falls, that the White resistance will fall. This is Captain Karsavin. He wakes up, he's in a field, he's bloody, he has some trouble getting up. He gets up, he looks around and finds
this is Andrei.
Drinks some water. This is Andrei,
Andrei's
the
blood.
communist.
Yeah.
Yep. And so he gets some water and he hears somebody just crawling towards him. He looks around and sees a guy who is in bad shape. Guy asks for water. He gives it to him. And then he starts to walk on and he hears somebody calling after him. And it turns out it's the other guy. And the guy says, let's walk together. I'm not really in a state to find my way right now.
Oh, I'm remembering this. Says, well, oh man, I just got the chills.
We're not going the same place.
Oh no.
Wherever we go, one of us is not going to want to be there. It's you or me,
And they don't know where they're going to end up, right? Oh man.
They have no idea. They're just walking, trying to find the closest town, some supplies, something. And it's clear at this point that Andrei is for the Red Army and the other guy is for the White Army.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, they make their way, and at some point, the guy in white stumbles and is unable to walk, and Andrei continues to help him. And I think that is probably enough to indicate Andrei's character. I don't want to keep going because this is just such a great scene that I'd hate to spoil for first-time readers. So just treat that, I guess, for you as an irresistible reason to read this book. Well,
again. It's a deep conflict. You could say that it's very, in terms of being the reader, even because it's two admirable men, and as men, right? Like as fighters, as courageous, strong, masculine traits, and they're like. If you've watched like Band of Brothers, they're like the guy who, while the bullets are flying, and everyone's crawling and crying, they're standing up and saying, go, they're like with bullets, right? Like they're that kind of heroic stature person, right? And they're both like that. And they're both equals in that sense, but they're just on two sides of a war, and they're just two ideologies. Or at least, one stands for the old order, and one stands for the new order in a sense. And so they're walking down, and I think it'd be nice for people to read what happens, because they're not fighting each other, and they're just going to figure out what happens and who, whose arms they end up in and everything. So it's a really, I think that is a good sense of who is Andrei, and getting a sense for the complexity of his character, because he's not just some, like I would think that cardboard cutout characters are almost in all movies and TV shows today, where the evil character is essentially just evil because he's evil. I want to destroy, the villain is like an industrialist who just wants to destroy the planet. Why? Just because money. That's it. And that's his only motivation. And it's like, that's a cardboard cutout, man. But this is a guy who has deep, there's depth to him, and he respects men who have certain traits. He knows that they're the enemy. And he goes through an arc because he realizes with Kira that there is a conflict here for him, that she is not, when they meet, I want to talk about how Kira meets both Leo and Andrei, because there's actually similarities in both of them. That she's mistook for something else, and there's a song playing. I don't think that's an accident. So when she meets Leo first, and we'll talk about that second, because we're talking about Andrei. But she meets Andrei when Sonia.
Yep.
Or is it Sonia? When Comrade Sonia gets her to go to vote for this, the leader of the students or whatever, the proletariat students. Anyway, they're doing this Internationale, their hymn, which is a big one for the communists. Like it's like their hymn. I don't remember what it's called. And
it's the communist anthem, the Internationale.
Yeah, the communist anthem. Thank you. And she says it's very beautiful and touching, and it makes a beautiful funeral march. It's just what she says, right?
Well,
and what
she says that the lyrics are as gray as dirty dishwater, but the sound of the music itself will make for a beautiful funeral march when the communist regime falls.
And she says this in a room full of communists, and she gets grabbed by this arm, and he's like, "Do you know, you little fool? Do you know what you're saying?" And and we don't know this at first, but we learn that that's Andrei. And, because we learn by the scar, he has a scar across his face, and he has gray eyes just like hers. But but the point is that he grabs her, he calls her a little fool. And then later he sees her and they have a conversation, and she has she talks differently, but it's right from the beginning. He knows that she is a, daughter of bourgeois, and she has that philosophy, or that background, and he expects some things of her, but he's surprised that she is also a crusader, in the sense that she would be the same type of person, not maybe not literally, but she's the type of person who, when the bullets are flying, she's the first one forward. And I'm just using that image as like a cliche, but just to kind of evoke the emotions of the kind of heroism that I think Andrei represents as the crusader. Think about like a literal crusader during medieval times, going into the land of infidels and, bravely. Yeah. That's who he is, but that's who Kira is. And they meet each other that way.
Rand has a beautiful explanation of this, and it's in Kira's voice here. She says to Andrei, if our souls met, they would tear each other apart. But when they got down to the root, they would find that they are similar. And so that's what they both feel from an early stage in their relationship, is that there's something similar, even though they hold absolutely opposite political views and views about society, they have a similar view of life. And I think Kira sees that in Andrei, that view of life is there, but it is muted. It is buried under this ideal that he has that she doesn't think makes any sense.
Well, and that's what he has to learn. And all the characters do learn something. They do have an arc. Andrei has to learn that his crusade is wrong. And this goes into the deeper themes, which we haven't really touched on yet, but we could talk about in a minute. But that what he believes in, what he's crusading for is wrong. It's the wrong crusade. And that Kira's crusade is the correct crusade. Now, it's helpful, I think, to contrast him with Leo and to compare him, I guess, with Leo, because Leo is also he's drawn in Kira's mind as a potential crusader, but he never quite makes it. But he has the same sense, and he's drawn as he's an Apollo-like look. And this is, by the way, a lot of, if you do look up stuff about Rand, you'll hear the comparisons with Hugo. This is, I think, where a lot of the Hugo stuff, especially with Leo, I think he's a very Hugo-esque type character, especially if you read Les Miserables. But so there is those comparisons of this like larger than life. He's straight, tall, beautiful. Women are attracted to him, but he doesn't really pay attention to most of them. And there is this sense, like I think it's described. I think I have it written down somewhere here, but something like he's the type of person who would order an execution and be able to watch it, right? Like that's the kind of person who like, and not an execution just for the sake of an execution, but in a crusade, right? Again, if you have an infidel that you really believe is evil. So this is one criticism of Rand, is that there, that there are stark lines, that it's like, there's a person that's evil, there's a person that's good. I think, people today have a hard time with that, because they think that nobody's good or evil. Like everybody has evil in them. That is the cliche of our era. Everybody is a little bit of gray, right? Everybody has some evil, everybody has some good in them. in Rand's literature in particular, there's Kira's good and that person's bad, and Leo, he's good and there are people that are bad. And if he was on a crusade, he would have no problem executing and watching the execution because it's evil, right? So in comparing them, Leo is like Andrei in that sense, except I think this is the major thing. He doesn't, how does he put it? I want the desire to desire, right? Like he lacks the desire to desire. So Andrei has a deep desire to see the spread and the growth of the red communist ideology throughout all of Russia and the world. That's his crusade. Kira has one for living her own life, to be an engineer, to enjoy beautiful music, to, dance on a top of a building with beautiful lights and tinkling glasses, and her favorite song, the Song of Broken Glass, things like that. She wants to live life to its fullest, like her life. That's her crusade. Leo doesn't have a crusade, but you get the sense that he would have a crusade, right? And that, I think, is what Kira sees in him, except, and maybe you could tell there's one problem with why Leo can't have a crusade, and I think this goes into the theme of the novel.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm getting exactly what you're pointing to, but I think that a big part of this is it's the indignity of life under the Soviets.
That's
and
it,
the absolute inability to live your life the way that you want to. And perhaps what you're getting at is the theme of individualism versus collectivism. So individualism, it's never been more eloquently put than in the Declaration of Independence, that we have rights to our life, to liberty, and to the pursuit of happiness, versus collectivism, this idea that the individual has he has no right to his own life. His life and his work belong to the group, the collective, the state, and the state can sacrifice him at will. I think Leo sees very clearly, and he says at one point, the people that don't see clearly today are those that have the easiest lives. It's easier to be blind in an age like ours than to be sighted, because if you do have any sort of ambitions for your life, they're going to be crushed. You are absolutely going to be crushed. So it's better to give up. And in fact, in the earlier conversations that he has with Kira, he asks, so do you think it's worthwhile to pursue building these glass skyscrapers and aluminum bridges? It might have been worthwhile centuries ago, and it might be worthwhile centuries from now, but I doubt it. And it's certainly not worthwhile today. And so Leo he's a strong-willed person, but he's not strong enough to maintain his optimism and his love of life in the face of this crushing collectivism, this state that makes all of one's decisions for you, that asks you to get a permit to do anything, to go on a vacation, to get a job. You need a permit, or you need to be a part of this union group. You need to do this many hours of civic service. And Leo, he's looking around and seeing, well, this is no way to live, and we have no chance. We have no hope. So I think he, in the face of these just terrible indignities, is unable to put up with the daily grind. And Kira is fierce. She's much fiercer than Leo in this respect. She's unable to give up her vision of what life could and should be, and she pursues it to the end. So,
no, I think that's exactly what I was thinking, and it comes across really clear when you read the book for yourself. So you can't just take our words for it, because so much of what we're talking about is in the narrative descriptions that Ayn Rand puts into this and the background. So, maybe we could talk a little bit about that in terms of the Ayn Rand said that maybe you remember this quote, but she said something like the background is real, the plot is invented. Right. And so what she means by that is she experienced the Russian Revolution, and she has firsthand knowledge of what actually happened, in terms of the people, what happened to the buildings, the look on the buildings, that world that she's creating in We the Living is very real. And at the time, I will say something outside of the novel. I think at the time of publication, America just did not want to see that. And it took 80 years now. What is it? It's been 85 years now or something.
85 years it will be in April.
Yeah, it's taken 85 years for people to start, I think, really. I mean, people have known this for a while, to be fair, but it's, since maybe the 80s, we could say. But it's taken a long time for people to really see how horrific conditions were in the Soviet Russia in the 1920s. But Ayn Rand was talking about this in the 30s, before anybody else really. And that's, she was one of the early ones. Yeah, go ahead.
When the book was released in 36, it met great success overseas in Europe, in England, great reviews. Obviously, the reviews were mixed based on one's prior political beliefs, but many in Europe really saw the message of the book and they understood what was happening. And here in America, America was experiencing the Red Decade. Her publisher actually sort of accidentally allowed the prints or the plates for her book to be destroyed prematurely after only 18 months as sales were just starting to pick up. And then not only were the plates destroyed, Rand attempted to work with a producer to put on a play version called The Unconquered, a play of We the Living. And she got into a contract with a guy he was very famous for producing several very successful comedies. And he said that he wanted to go into more dramatic art. And so they began to work together on We the Living. And even right up until about a week before, they auditioned somebody who did a stellar job playing Kira. And he said only then did he understand what the book was really about. He didn't even really understand the story, and he did a horrible job. And so left a really bad taste in people's mouths with this Ayn Rand person who was trying to tell the story about Soviet Russia. And so the book went, in America, it went out of print and it wasn't reissued until 1959 after Rand had tremendous success with Atlas Shrugged. Again, though, in 59, there were a smattering of reviews, many of them very, very positive, and people understood, and Rand repeated, this is not a book about Soviet Russia in 1925. This is about dictatorship whenever and wherever it exists, whether it's
collectivism.
Soviet Russia and collectivism.
Yeah.
Whether it's Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany, or which the book might help to prevent, a socialist America.
Yep.
And so this is why the book has had such staying power. It's now gone through 6 editions. It's sold more than 3 million copies. Is that this universal theme of individualism versus collectivism is incredibly relevant. It's been relevant for decades, and it's as relevant today as it was when it was first published.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that I don't think intellectuals are capable of understanding that. The way you just said about, and I want to stress capable, like there's something blocking their abilities. I think it may be the ideas that they've accepted, but from seeing that this is not just a book about or against communism. That's how it's often classified, as this is an anti-communist book. Which, yeah, it's an anti-communist book, but it's also an anti-socialist book. It's an anti-Nazis book. It's an anti-mixed economy American book, right? It's an anti, collectivism and all of its manifestations, however it comes into form, out in the world and in yourself in a sense, because a lot of these characters, do embody, like Victor in the novel We the Living, embodies this character of, he's a pragmatist, but he spouts out these things about, we have to do this for the collective. Oh, Kira, you can't be an engineer because you want to be an engineer. You should, even if it's good for the state, your motivation should be, it's good for the state. It's good for people. And that's how you should be thinking. And really, as a woman, you should be thinking about, womanly things that are good for the state and for the collective. And then Kira has that great line of like, what's the collective? Is it the corner grocer? Is it that fat woman over there or something? And he says, it's the whole state. Well, if you add up a whole line of zeros, it's still zero, right? But the point is that I think intellectuals have a hard time grasping that integration of its, collectivism in all of its forms. It's not just this one manifestation. And when I've talked to normal quote unquote people who aren't PhDs in, literature or philosophy, they seem to get that much easier. They seem to understand that collectivism is a problem, and the idea of doing something, being motivated by something, for, like I'm going to be a doctor, not because I want to live a good life and I love, science and I really enjoy making money that collectivism would be, oh, I want to do this because, or I have to do this because it's my duty to society. It's my job. I happen to be good at it, so I'll do it. People that I've talked to can glean the difference between those two motivations. And I've noticed that intellectuals, at least in reading their reviews, they either refuse to get it or they're just incapable of grasping that truth, which I think is a power of Rand.
There's a really funny story that eloquently illustrates the point you're making. And that's that in 1942, some directors in Italy. Now we're here in fascist Italy under Mussolini.
During World War II.
Yes, yeah. Yes. During World War II in fascist Italy. And, the Italian fascist government was very clear that it thought that movies were absolutely essential to the war because they needed the propaganda to convince people that what they were doing was right. And so they found this book and, it's anti-communist, it's anti-Russian. The Russians fighting against the Italians. So we want to make a movie of this. And so they did. The various propaganda departments created this movie, and some of the people that were involved really understood the message and were anti-fascist. And so they did their best to make the best movie that they could in fascist Italy. And this got past the censors. It got past the fascist censors because, it's anti-communist. But the movie became a tremendous success in Italy because the people understood that this is not just anti-communist. This is anti-collectivism. This is anti-dictatorship. The movie went on to win an award that year and soon was canned because the fascist government realized that this was stoking the anti-fascist flame in Italy. And so the intellectuals who were charged with filtering this sort of thing out didn't see it or were incapable of filtering it out. And the people did. The people en masse saw that, okay, this is anti-collectivism and we are in love with this film. And it got rave reviews there and people really loved the film. And Rand, when she initially heard about it, she was furious because she thought, well, they've somehow chopped up my film and turned it into something that is pro-fascist. But when she met Alida Valli, who played Kira in the film and talked to some of the people that were involved with it and learned what actually happened in Italy, she was elated that she was able to actually help stoke the culture there in a more individualistic direction. So I think that really underscores the point you were making about intellectuals not being able to see that.
I think the conclusion of that story is Mussolini burned that. He had him burned. And now you can get that version. I think you could buy the DVD for We the Living. It was done in 2 different forms. But yeah, I mean, that's a good story about the intellectuals not understanding, but the people could see that this has nothing to do with communism versus fascism, or it's, here's some anti-fascist or anti-communist movie. They saw it as, this is destroying Kira and Leo. And those are the good people in the world. Those are people with ambition who are trying to make a better world, who want to build skyscrapers and make something of themselves. And in doing that, they do help the world. Now, we could talk about We the Living forever. So I wanted to conclude, and with these last bits, a little bit of time, I would like to talk about, and we can talk about plot and other stuff as well as we finish this up. But I'd like to talk about what it means to us personally and what we think the relevance is to today. I mean, we've kind of touched on the relevance thing, but I just want to say real quick that I read this when I was, I think, 19. I didn't understand it, and I was coming out of a fog from K through 12. That's how I think of my first 18 years of life, as it was a fog. And at 35, I'm starting to have a much clearer sense of life and of my own thoughts that I don't think I had, even 10, 15 years ago. And so I really didn't understand any of this stuff that I was reading, but I knew there was something there. And I read it a couple more times. And this was the second book of Rand's that I read. In rereading it now, from talking to you, you got me to reread it. I was immediately struck by, one, how good the writing is, how absolutely different than anything I read today when I do read stuff today. I mean, she has actual metaphors and similes and comparisons, and they don't do that anymore. Like since Hemingway and, literarily, they rarely, it's like one, it's almost like there's a rule, like one simile, one metaphor, one analogy every like chapter or something like that. You could have one really powerful one and that's it. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but it seems like everything is either in first person or it's like a straightforward journalistic description of things. And Rand has these beautiful, wonderful metaphors, which are almost poetic in the way that they, make you think, and they force you to think about what's really going on. I think that's one thing that a lot of people may not like about Rand, is that you cannot passively read it, whereas some modern stuff you can, because they often tell you how you're supposed to be feeling. In either narrative, they'll sum up what you should be thinking about. Rand doesn't really do that, and she makes you come to an evaluation of the descriptions and the images she has of these characters, which I think is challenging for people, especially those academics. But I was also struck, in terms of relevance today. I was reading it, and I think it's like page, like right at the beginning. I'm only on page or chapter. I think I'm, like chapter 6 or something. I don't know, but right at the beginning, there's a boil water notice, and I started reading this again in Austin when there's a boil water notice after we just had this quote unquote snowpocalypse and of 2021, and this is when the wind turbines stopped rotating. They didn't have the infrastructure. They weren't prepared. And, people were laying blame this way and that way. I'm not going to go into what I think really happened. I'll just, if I could plug Alex Epstein of the Center for Industrial Progress, go read his stuff. He does a great analysis of all the things taking into consideration. But the point is, for me, when I was reading this, I felt like, man, there's something going on. I mean, emergencies happen, but just seeing a boil water notice, seeing this, like the sense of separation between people, and I'm living in this society where you're supposed to be separated. People are diseased. They're described as diseased in Ayn Rand stuff. St. Petrograd's smelt of carbolic acid. So it's like there's this massive cleansing that's constantly going on. Carbolic acid is a very strong bacterial soap type stuff. So it really, resonates with the kind of world that I see America turning into when I'm, in my most pessimistic moods. But yeah, go ahead. I mean, those are just some of the things that it really means something to me right now in rereading it.
So I'll pick up where you're leaving off here with the impact or the importance today, and then go into what I think are the personal takeaways that are most important to me, and they're related. But so, yeah, this contest between individualism and collectivism still rages today. And I think this book is as important as ever. Should the individual be left free to decide whether or not to close his business during a pandemic, or should a bureaucrat make that decision? Should someone who has not tested positive for a disease be forced by law to not travel, to wear a mask? So these are pertinent questions, and they relate to individualism versus collectivism. Should the product of someone's effort be sacrificed by the state to provide free or heavily subsidized healthcare or housing or education, food to those who don't have it or can't afford it? Or does the individual have a right to keep the product of his own effort? And obviously, this is a question posed by, among other things, the Green New Deal. Mm-hmm. Should people be judged by their own ideas and values, or should we judge them by the color of their skin? Is it just a fact that if you're white, you're inescapably racist, that you have no say in the matter? This is the question that is posed to us by, among others, the Black Lives Matter movement. The leaders of which, I think it's worth saying, have on the record said that they are trained Marxists.
Mm-hmm.
Should white people who have never owned slaves be forced to pay reparations to black people who have never been enslaved? Do we believe, as Hitler did, that individuals should be judged not on the basis of their actions and ideas, but on the basis of their group? This is the sort of thing that Ta-Nehisi Coates and Robin DiAngelo, author of White Fragility, are preaching today. So We the Living, this theme of individualism versus collectivism, is incredibly important to resolving these questions that we face today. So what does We the Living mean to me personally? I think I would like to close here with both a political note and then also a more personal one. Obviously, the things we've been talking about are political here, but I want to quote Rand here, who said that volumes can be and have been written about the issue of freedom versus dictatorship, but in essence, it comes down to a single question. Do you consider it moral to treat men as sacrificial animals and to rule them by physical force? If, as a citizen of the freest country in the world, you do not know what this would actually mean, We the Living will help you to know. So this is the question that we were just talking about here. For me personally, and I'm involved, like I said, I teach this course on writing in defense of liberty. And it's always important for me to keep in mind why I do that, why personally I have a stake in doing that. And there's a line in We the Living that I think captures this. I think we alluded to it earlier. I'm just going to paraphrase here. Kira says something. She's talking to Andrei, who said, I think that we should. He's telling her about communism and communism's goals, and she says, "Well, the difference between you and me is that I don't want to fight for the people. I don't want to fight against the people. I merely want to live. I want to live my life," and that's something that is really impactful for me, because that is why I do what I do. And it's, it's not because I feel some duty, because I like this idea and I want to promote it. It's because I want to live my life. And in order to do that, I need to be free to live my life. And Kira and Leo and all the other characters in We the Living show us very eloquently what happens when individuals aren't free to live their lives.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important point, because like I said, we could talk forever about We the Living, but we didn't really get too deep into the themes. But I think one of the things that you see is that, essentially the theme you're talking about, collectivism versus individuality or individualism. But there's, her original title for this was called Airtight, and for We the Living was Airtight originally, or I guess her working title. And what she was trying to convey was like, how in this world that, we talked about the context and the background of We the Living and the world that she built, how the world makes it impossible in a sense to live your life. But to show that, she had to show someone who really was a liver of life, at the ultimate type of liver of life. And in her view, and in Rand's capability at this point, it was Kira, right? It would later evolve into Howard Roark and then John Galt as the ultimate, in a sense, in Atlas Shrugged. But at this point in her writing career, it's Kira. And so you have to see Kira as this optimistic person trying to survive, or not just survive, but putting aside and not caring about any of these irrelevant things, like she has to go get a labor book, right? And I think a wonderful passage when she gets her labor book, which is basically a passport. And it's mind-boggling to me as an American, who I know today we have to go out with our driver's license, but I sometimes have gone jogging or something without one. But like in this time, you had, everywhere you went, you had to have your labor book, your passport, and it told you where you worked, where you didn't work, when you left your last job, and all the things of your life, and they controlled everything. And in the passage, it shows that Rand writes, it shows Kira. He gives the background of her as this person as she's getting this labor book that is going to control and kind of monitor her entire life. And it's this horrifically beautiful, I guess, is, encapsulation of the whole story in that moment, I think, where it's like Kira has, she's this type of person who's had this history. This is her real history of leading up to her wanting to be an engineer, the type of woman she is, and the future she wants as she's getting this thing, which is essentially, handcuffing her to, some bureaucrat and everything, and which makes it impossible to live. So I think that's such an important point to see We the Living as a novel that tells us and shows us, not just tells us, but really shows us what that world looks like and why living has to be in a free society. We have to have a free society. It's not an option. And I guess if I could say one last thing, this is the last thing I would say, and then if you have any final thoughts on the book, that'd be great, is there are a lot of, and I think you alluded to this, but there are a lot of books, ideas, thinkers. There's, Solzhenitsyn, which I know Jordan Peterson loves, Gulag Archipelago. There are stories about the Gulag. There are stories about how evil dictators are. But there are very few, if any, stories, and I think there's none, actually. I think it's just Rand, who really shows that, it doesn't matter if you have the best leadership. It doesn't matter if all the people, if all the excesses of collectivism, of totality, of communism and socialist Nazism, if all those excesses that led to concentration camps, led to mass slaughter, led to famines on a grand scale, if you could somehow get rid of those, that somehow collectivism would be good for people, like living for other people would somehow be good. You get that, like with the Gulag Archipelago, you get how evil the gulags are and that kind of life of gulags. I don't think, and it's good to know, and I think that's helpful, but that's not what's wrong with collectivism. That's a byproduct of collectivism. Rand gets to the root and shows you that it really, it destroys people like the Leos from even having a desire, who they would be great men. It destroys the Kiras, the engineers, the tech entrepreneurs in our world, the doctors. They don't want to, pursue their own lives. And it elevates the victor characters who are pragmatic and they don't care. And those are the type of people who rise up. And it even kills the Pavels, and I think Pavel was the guy, and the Andres, the best, those crusaders. It also has to destroy them. And it shows the logic of that. And I think that is one of the greatest visions you can get of why collectivism is bad. It's not because of gulags. That's not the essence of why it's bad. That's a byproduct, but it's because you can't live your life.
Yeah. I think, in essence, what Rand wanted to say here is that there's something precious and sacred about human life, about the individual human life, that no man or group of men, no collective or government should ever have power over, ever have unlimited power over, should never be able to snuff out as they did in Russia. So We the Living, Rand's first novel, heavily autobiographical. She said she'd never write an autobiography, but many of the specific events happened to her. There are tons of comparisons that we could go into. We'll have to save that for another time.
Yeah.
If you're interested in the conflict of our age, a conflict that's been raging for decades, go check out We the Living for yourself.
Yeah. That's the only way to do it. Read We the Living. Check out the Objective Standard Institute. See what they're doing over there, because they have articles on art and philosophy, and you can read more about Ayn Rand. But at the end of the day, you can never get as good of an understanding of Ayn Rand from outside of reading her. Just read her for yourself. Try to get rid of as much that you might have heard outside, including our praise. And just read her for yourself and just get your own evaluation and try to understand it. And that's really all there is to it. So Jon, thank you so much. And I really hope to have you on to talk about, we could do a part 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of We the Living and talk forever, or other books, but you're welcome back anytime. I really had a great time today.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on. There are all sorts of great books we could talk about. I'd love to talk about this one again, or or any other really. So let's chat. Thanks again.
All right. Take care.